I would like to welcome you all to our first talk on the series Management of Important Zoonotic Diseases in Africa, especially in wildlife. And I would like to thank Karen for initiating this. And a special welcome to the TUT students who are our primary audience. Yeah, thank you so much for joining in time. And today's topic is wildlife and rabies. So rabies, to me, rabies has had an effect in my life. It has shaped me into the person who I am today. I studied veterinary medicine because of my experience with rabies. So a few years ago, back in my home district, there was our neighbor who had a daughter of age maybe she was about 8 to 9. And she would come to my place to play with my young cousin, and I could see her every day until this other day she got bitten by a dog. But then the parents didn't have knowledge on rabies. So they thought it's a small wound. And we all thought it was a small wound because at that time I was also a teacher, a primary school teacher. I knew about rabies, but I didn't know that it was a very serious thing. So the child was not taken to the hospital. And of course, yes, she got better after a few days. The wound was okay. And yeah, she continued playing normally and everything was back to normal. Then after about 7 to 8 months, she got sick. And from nowhere, she became so aggressive. She could bark like a dog. When the parents rushed with her to the hospital, it was too late. They couldn't do anything at the hospital. And after a few days, we lost her just like that. And then I became so curious about rabies. That's when I said, no, I want to study veterinary medicine so that I should come to understand about rabies, understand how we can prevent it, how we can prevent the deaths like those of our neighbor's daughter. And today I'm very excited that we're discussing this. We're discussing this topic and we're sharing knowledge because I know all the students who are here, they are multipliers. Because in their life, they may meet a certain, like the same situation and they will know how to handle it after learning. They'll observe animals in the wildlife areas who have rabies and they'll be able to say this is rabies after this session. So I'm excited to introduce to you our speaker today, Professor Katja. She's someone who has done a lot in wildlife. She's working with the University of Pretoria, and she has done her PhD, not master's, PhD in rabies. Yeah, and it's very interesting to see. I was reading the topic. It's very interesting. She did about the oral vaccine in jackals, which is very interesting. And also, she's someone who has a passion for conservation. She has worked with several organizations and projects on conservation as an advisor when it comes to veterinary. And with these few remarks, ladies and gentlemen, the TUT students, let's welcome Professor Katja Koeppel.
Thank you, everybody, for spending your evening with me and listening to me and rabies. And as Sela has pointed out, I'm incredibly passionate about it. And I really want to show you what it's all about and why I think it's such an important topic. So let me just see that the presentation comes online. Then we can all see it. And then hopefully, it won't let me share in the moment. Let me just try again.
Right. So as Professor is sharing, please, as she will be presenting, feel free to write your questions in the chats. At the end, we'll read them out and you will also be given a chance to ask the questions. Yeah, so enjoy.
And I will show you that throughout the presentation. that they always come up together. So as one case increases in one species, it increases in the other species because there's more rabies in the environment. And then obviously humans are affected. And I'm going to come back to the humans later. So if we're looking at rabies worldwide, there is a lot of different hosts that are responsible for rabies. So for those of you who heard that, no, bats always carry rabies, they carry ELISA virus, but bat rabies is not very big in South Africa. Doesn't mean you should get bitten by a bat. I think you should be aware of it, but it occurs much more frequent in South America. So if you look at South America, bats are a huge problem, and they actually spread rabies to things like dairy cows, cows in the field, because they bite them and then transmit the virus. But if you're starting off with the North America, you can see the foxes, the skunk, the raccoons. So there we have actually eradicated rabies from the dogs through vaccination campaigns, and it's now driven in the wildlife species. While if you're going to look into South America and South Africa, or Africa as such, you can see that the dog is actually playing a bigger role. So in the areas where vaccination of dogs is not mandatory or not done affecting all the animals, you're going to have rabies outbreaks in the dogs. In the other areas, it is more spread by wildlife. So you have to be a little bit aware of what's happening in which area to be aware of who's actually your primary host. And if you look at this map, if anybody of you know what that is, it's a yellow mongoose. Well, that's not all there is for the whole of Southern Africa. So this is a very simplified map, and I'm going to come into a bit more detail about it. But what is it? So I said it already, it's caused by rabies ELISA virus. It's a negatively stranded RNA virus, and you can see that image of that virus on the right-hand side. It came from bats, and that's why, the bats still host the ELISA virus, but it's been in the canine host for 1,400 years. So it's really well adapted to the species. And as you heard, it's a zoonotic disease, which means it will spread from animals to humans, and actually all warm-blooded animals. So if you think about it, even birds can get rabies. They are not very important. And I think in the whole time we were monitoring it in South Africa since 1964, we've only had 2 cases in birds. So, so they're not important, but you just should be aware that they're also included in this. There is incubation periods, and as you heard from Stella, that child was 8 months. Well, it can vary from anywhere from a few days to a few months. And what Stella also said to you is it's fatal once clinical signs appear. So it's really important that if you think you have been exposed, then and you go and see the medical profession, there is actually an algorithm where they see how high your risk is and what your treatment options are. Some of the treatment options is just vaccination. Some of them is hyperimmune plasma. So it depends a little bit on the severity of the bite, where the bite is, how risky it is for the transmission, and then the medical practitioner will take it from there. But as Stella said, you need to be aware of it. If you do not know that it could be rabies, and you're not even thinking about the disease, and you're just thinking about the bite, then it's a major problem. And what you should start off with any bite is wash it with water, soap and water. So it's actually been shown if you wash that with soap and water, you can actually take away a lot of that rabies virus that is present in that wound edges. So that should always be your first treatment, is soap and water, and washing it out frequently. And then you need to take medical attention within 24 hours. Because if you can get vaccinated or treated, it's curable. If not, it's fatal. There's one human that survived in all the years, which was a girl in the USA. And they put her in an artificial coma, and they treated her once the clinical signs appeared, and she survived, but she is severely debilitated. So it's not like it is a normal person after that. So think about it. This is a disease that is treatable if seen early, and if neglected till clinical sign is fatal. Worldwide, 90% of all the cases are associated with domestic dog. So only 10% of wildlife cases. So keep that in mind when you're exposed and when you're dealing with different wildlife. So this is a map of canine rabies, so just dog rabies. And there you can see very clearly who is sort of the host of rabies there's in the dog. So we've got the whole of Africa, India, And then you can see Madagascar is also affected a little bit. KZN for us is very, very high. And then the other areas are sort of lower or below. If we're looking at the next map, that's wildlife. And there you can see South Africa is suddenly coming up. So wildlife is a big problem. It's endemic. Again, North America, it's sort of Russia, bit of India. So you can see the importance. So there's a difference between wildlife-associated rabies and dog rabies, but the treatment and the approach is the same. This is a little bit zoomed in, and that's just from literature studies. So looking at the different wildlife, how much is wildlife really responsible for rabies in the country? So if you're looking at Zambia, it's about 4.5%. Zimbabwe, much higher, 24%. Namibia, 30%. Botswana, 15%. Wildlife in South Africa is 16%. Swaziland, Lesotho, and Mozambique don't have any percentage, which means the wildlife is negligence. It's all dog associated in these countries. So there the wildlife really doesn't play a big role. So if you're looking at your rabies cases in Africa, sort of wildlife to canine, you can sort of look at it here. Here you can see Swaziland was like the one, but it's really not an important driver of wildlife overall. Now, why is wildlife so important? Now you can see this wonderful camera image of the jackal and the dog. It's actually taken on my property, but you can see the interaction between jackals and domestic animals and humans. And you're looking at this fencing. No, that's not stopping wildlife going under or through. You know, the jackals often go through the hole underneath done by the warthogs. So they're moving in and out and therefore cause disease, even though you think you are in a secure area. This is for my study, for my PhD, where I basically just looked at who's responsible. So how many cases are there? What is the importance? You can see dog cases are over 7,000. And then it goes down from cattle to cat to goat to sheep to horse to other farm animals that went. But there's also your ostrich that I was mentioned before. And then if you're looking at your right-hand side, you can see the wildlife species. And you can see mongooses, aardwolf, bat-eared foxes, they're all responsible there. And then the number gets smaller as we go down. So you just to see how the different species are involved. And if you think about it, and you're all nature conservation students, so what do you notice when you look at the wildlife? You notice these are carnivore species. So the carnivore species are the species that are really paying a big effect in the rabies, because obviously when they get rabies, they bite each other, so they spread it on. And they also move over distance, and that way they are maintaining the rabies and they're continuing the rabies. So for rabies to really have an effect, you need more than one animal, because if that animal dies, let's say, for example, that jackal will die in 5 days because it has rabies. So if it doesn't meet another jackal in 5 days, it's going to die somewhere in the bush. Nobody's going to care. And the disease will die out because it didn't meet. If that jackal now meets 10 other jackals in these 5 days, then it's going to spread it to 10 others. And then these 10 others will spread it in the 5 days till they die, and so on. So you can think about, it really depends on how many animals are in an area, how many susceptible animals are in an area, and how easy do these animals spread it from each other. And we're going to come back to that. But think about it. It's just, you need the animals, you need a certain density. These animals need to meet, and you need to spread before you die. Otherwise, you can't spread it. So these are the trends. And if you're looking at there, the purple is the overall. The blue is the dogs. And as you can see the bottom, you can see the wildlife and the livestock. And as you can see, the livestock is really closely mimicked by outbreaks in dogs. So as the outbreaks in dogs increase, so do the outbreaks in livestock. Wildlife a little bit less, but it follows the same trend. So as you have an increase, it tends to spread between species, and you get more and more. Vaccinations. You've all heard this is secure. Now think about it. You're not vets, so you don't need to know about it, but just be aware of it. The different rabies vaccines that we have in country have different requirements of how often they should be repeated and when they can be used. So when you're using it, if you've been part of a rabies campaign, just be aware which one are you using and what is the significance of it. So Rabies, which is the top one, should be done on an annual basis, while the Novivax can be done every 2 years for livestock and even 3 years for dogs and cats. And then the defensa, again, can be every 3 years in dogs and cats. Now, this is what the package insert said. Does anybody know what the law says? So the law in South Africa says that you have to vaccinate your dogs, your cats annually, because they can't check which vaccine was used when and how often they used it and how big a risk you in the area is. So the government just put in one particular clause and said, if you want to move from your animal from province to province, you have to have annual vaccination. End of story. Doesn't matter which vaccination you use. This is the rules. So just be aware of it. Now it's going back to wildlife, my favorite. And this is what we're going to talk about. We're going to zoom in. For those of you who knows where we are here in Gauteng, our favorite province. And this is what we're going to talk about, this little red blob over there, which is high rabies outbreaks in, as you can see, jackal, black-backed jackal. So the reds here are your jackals. The yellows are your aardwolf. The green is the bat-eared fox. And your mongooses are in blue. And the blue doesn't show up as nicely, but basically the Free State is blue. So each area is obviously dependent on where the animal occurs. So it's really nice to say it occurs in yellow mongoose, but if you don't have yellow mongoose in the area, you're not going to have rabies in yellow mongoose. So it's where the animal occurs, where there's high enough density, as discussed beforehand, for it to be maintained in that species. And so that's how this map is generated. So in the arid areas, aardwolf and bat-eared foxes are really important in rabies transmission because they can maintain it and then pass it back. Even though you've had it eradicated, they can maintain it within them and then pass it back to your dogs 3 years later. So that's why it's important. So if you look at cases, so this is just from 1993 to 2019. And the reason it doesn't go past 1993, for those of you who remember, is that the provincial and the municipal boundaries changed. So it's there is data before that, but they were in different boundaries. So it's really difficult to combine them because now there was overlaps. So that's why 1993 is the cutoff I looked at to look at. So what would you say? If you look at this map, which area is the highest area of rabies? So if anybody have an idea, think about it. Which area is the highest rabies? And those of you who said KZN, you're right. KZN has got that big fat wheel. So that's where our outbreaks are. That's where the majority of our outbreaks are. And the majority of the outbreaks are in dogs. So in KZN, we have massive problems with dogs and rabies. And a lot of our human fatalities come from that area. And as you can look at the different areas. So in the Western Cape, for example, dogs really don't play a role. It's wildlife. And the same for the Northern Cape. You know, these areas, it's wildlife driven, not driven by dogs. And if you want to do something or if you want to educate somebody, you really need to know who's the responsible person. Now, we were already referring to, there's fun stuff to do with rabies vaccines. So if you have problems in wildlife, you can't just go and catch all the jackals and inject them, because how are you going to catch all the jackals? So it's not manageable to inject wildlife and say, okay, now you get your vaccination certificate and you're good. You need to find another way. So what Boehringer Ingelheimer did, they produced an oral vaccine for use in raccoons, because that's the problem they're having in North America, and coyotes and red and foxes. And they came up with this vaccine. But now you've already heard, rabies is zoonotic and fatal. Now, the vaccine that we inject into the dog is a kill dog vaccine. So it cannot cause disease. Even if something goes completely wrong, you gave 10 times the overdose, you might just have a very flat dog because you gave him so much stimulation, but he's not going to get rabies. And that's why we use the injectable killed vaccine when we deal with wildlife, with domestic animals. But in wildlife, it doesn't work. And giving a killed vaccine in oral stuff doesn't work either, because it doesn't stimulate the immune system enough when you eat it. So you need something that is a little bit better than a killed vaccine. So what we did there, or what they did, is a recombinant vaccine. Now, recombinant means you combine two things together. So if you're looking here at the top, you've got your vaccinia virus. Vaccinia virus basically means it's a pox virus. So you take your pox, you take a piece out of its wonderful DNA, you slice a piece of DNA that we already looked on the rabies virus on the side, so it's got all the antibodies on, you shove it in there. And you put it back in there. So what happens when the body is then in contact with this live pox virus, with a little bit of rabies in the middle, that it goes in the cell, and then the cell responds to that little bit of antigen in there, and it produces antibodies, which are all these little red things out there. And these antibodies that your cells now have will protect you against rabies. So it's a really clever idea, because the worst can happen if somebody picks up my wonderful bait and eats it. Not that I think fish meal is the favorite thing of humans, but you could get a pox infection. But you can't die of rabies. So it's a safe application. So let's look what to do with it next. I promised you we're going to go and look a bit more where you are. So for those of you who are familiar with the map, this is Hartbeespoort, and this is the so-called cradle of humankind. It's a World Heritage Site. It's got lots of fossil deposits, lots of wildlife, lots of jackals, and lots of problems because of that. So these are the rabies cases, and you can see my jackals are these wonderful diamonds in dark blue, and they are all over. So this is the problem we were having, and they were spreading it to horses and cows and even my sheep. So then we looked at it. Just throwing out that fish block that was designed for raccoons wouldn't be very effective, because we don't even know if jackals like it. So how can I put a vaccine out in a fish block if I don't know if the jackal would eat the fish block, because maybe it doesn't like fish? So what we did, we started with a really simple trial where I put those fish meals out, but it doesn't actually have any vaccine in it. It just had water in it, but it looked the same as the vaccine and everything else. So basically, like on the airplane, the offer was beef or chicken or fish. So we had meat pieces, we had chicken heads, and we had the fish meals. And we asked the jackals, what would you like? Now the jackals are pretty silly, and they're like, oh, well, actually we like everything. Well, what we won't particularly mind, but we prefer chicken or fish. Well, those two are probably our favorite, and everything else liked meat. So the meat never even saw the jackal, because when we put it out, everything else decided that it's great for eating. So the jackals never got to it, because we would put it in late afternoon, and by the time the jackals came in dusk and dawn, there wasn't much meat left. So that didn't really work. So fish or chicken was it. Chicken was actually the best, but it was not so much better than the fish meal, and it needed a lot of work, because I had to take the chicken head, I had to shove the vaccine into each and every individual, and then I had a frog chicken head in my hand that I had to throw out in the field. While the fish block is little and small and could be thrown out, much more hygienic, so we settled for fish. We knew they were eating it. They would prefer the chicken, but the fish was okay. So we settled for the fish meal. Now, guys, pay attention. Do you see those little arrows? This is the fish meal, and this is the meat. Yeah, meat, beef block, fish meal. Camera trap, I'm nowhere near it, otherwise it wouldn't work. Who comes by and thinks it's super delicious? Unfortunately, it wasn't the species we had in mind, but we had other things that actually liked the fish blocks. So we lost quite a lot of the base. Now the warthog is vaccinated against rabies, but that really doesn't help us in the bigger picture, because they don't really transfer it to other species. But we lost some blocks. But here is the good news. And I know my numbers aren't very high, because I couldn't catch the jackals. As Kellen will tell you, they're quite intelligent and quite difficult to catch, but I only caught a few. But, so if you look here, the red line, and these are log transferred, so ignore them. So the numbers, it's below 0 because it's a log transfer. The red line is what's important. The red line is your protected antibodies. So if you're above the red line, you have antibodies and you're protected against red rabies, and that's from the records, so 0.5 international units. And if you're below the red line, you don't. At day 0, all my jackals that I gave the vaccine in a controlled environment didn't have any antibodies. So they've never seen rabies, they've never been vaccinated. Great. Should be like this. Then at 4 weeks, we had 9 jackals that are transferred. And at 12 weeks, we had 10. So the numbers were slightly worried because we couldn't get good samples for all of them. But you can see up to 48 weeks, we had beautiful antibody levels throughout the time. Now, you want to wonder know what these two are. These are two animals. They're sitting down here. Why are they down here? Well, these were the two dominant jackals that ate my bait block. And I know they ate my bait block, but they were super aggressive and they really wanted it and they swallowed it whole. The whole bait block was swallowed in one big gulp and gone. Now that doesn't work. So the box are designed that you actually need to chew it. And when you chew it, you get contact with a vaccine on your mucous membrane. And then you actually get antibodies. So if you swallow it whole, it goes into your stomach acid and it doesn't work anymore. So that's why these two did never seroconvert. It's not because they didn't need the vaccine, just because they were too greedy. So summary. For baiting of jackals, you need to know their habitat. You need to know what they like, how to distribute it. So if I distribute it in the middle of the day, warthogs will eat it. Crows will eat it. The crows actually figured out what I was doing and followed my vehicle to see, are you throwing any chickens today? Or maybe some beef block? So you need to know when to actually target your animals. So dusk and dawn works really well for jackal. So we usually went at dusk and threw it out just before they came out. So there was less antelope, no monkeys, less warthogs because they're gone to bed. You need to know at your density because you need to have at least enough bait blocks for all your animals and not everybody's going to find the block. So there's a lot of calculations on how many baits you put out, but you need to be efficient that you're covering all your square kilometers. You need to think about your population turnover. Now, the recommendation when you're starting with a study like this is actually you must do it every 6 months to ensure that you actually break through that rabies cycle, because there's some jackals that are going to go this way, and then there's some jackals that are going to go that way, and then mom has pups, and then she wants to transfer it to the pups. So you need to think about all these things when you're planning it. So how much is your population turnover? And how long does your bait last? How long will it last till it's eaten or till it's out there? So mine lasts for 5 days, even if it's cooked. So it's quite resistant. So even if the jackal eats it 3 days later, it would still work. The problem is usually there was no bait left 3 days later. So WOA, I'm sure you've all heard of it. World Organization of Animal Health. Used to be OIE, but now it came in sync with World Organization with the human side. So now WOA is in line with that. And they would like to have 85% of dogs vaccinated, 100% vaccinated. In the moment, 2005, we had 85% vaccinated. They want 100% vaccinated. 2022, we had only 62. Now that's a drop. They really wanted it high out there. Now, if you got any idea why we're dropping in vaccination in dogs, dogs are easy. You just catch them. Any ideas? Look at that. For those of you who thought about it, what happened in 2020? COVID happened. And because of COVID, had nothing to do with rabies. No effect on rabies whatsoever. But people didn't go out. They didn't meet other people. There was lockdowns. And what happened and what stopped was vaccination campaigns. So in 2020, only 5% of planned dog vaccination took place. So we have so much catch up to do from that time period. So sometimes a disease or an outbreak or a financial crisis might have huge effects on a disease that has nothing to do with it, just because it affects it in other ways. So some things to think about. So coming back, key control strategies, surveillance. You need to know if you have rabies and who's responsible for your rabies and which species is involved. You should have dog vaccination campaigns. You must control your population. It's no good vaccinating everybody. If everybody has 20 puppies and dying at 6 months of age, then you have just too high turnover. And you need to be aware of the disease. And that's what's really important. We want to talk about it. We want to talk about the disease. We want to talk about the importance of the disease so that we can prevent that girl die. And it's one death prevented. It's an important death prevented. And I think Sela will agree with me. It's really important that we actually stop that one girl from dying. So that's why awareness is really important. There are some references for you guys and a little, so you don't have to read them all, but just to say, this is some of the references I've been using. And with that, meet my jackals.
Wow. Thank you so much. I enjoyed your presentation. I learned, I laughed, and yeah, it was everything in entertainment, education. Yeah. So now we just open the floor to students. As we wait for the students, maybe Karen, if you have any comment.
I do. Katja, thank you so much for your talk, and thank you so much for coming out to speak to the students. What a lot of the students don't realize is I did help you out with a lot of your research work for your PhD, and I remember that was fantastic experience. And you really get to understand, the dynamics of the disease and what the role different wildlife plays in this disease. And it is that I try to explain to the students how important it is to understand specifically rabies as a wildlife disease. All these students are going to one day be wildlife managers and reserve managers, and the importance of not only understanding rabies in wildlife, but some of the risks facing humans. And you mentioned something about, the legislation around rabies vaccinations for dogs. What about humans? How long does a rabies vaccination last in humans? I know I had my rabies last year. How often should we be going for our rabies vaccination?
Well, it depends a little bit on your risk factors. So obviously, if you're handling stray dogs or you're in contact with wildlife highly suspected of rabies, if you're working in an area that takes rehab center that takes in injured and wildlife, you're at much higher risk because you're going to get the sick animals, the animals that are collapsed, the animals that look difficult, and people will bring them to you. So you should be definitely vaccinated. The vaccine recommendation is 5 years, but you can also check your titers. So there's opportunity, obviously, to check your antibody titers. And mine keeps going up without the vaccination, so they always worry about me because mine is sitting at like 50 or 60, and I haven't even been vaccinated in the last few years. So I just laugh at them. So, but yeah, I'm part of the people that do the hyperimmune rabies and antibody serum. So the students at honor support and the lecturers volunteer. And we because we're all vaccinated, they monitor our levels and we produce this plasma. So if somebody is really getting injured, they're getting our antibodies, because then at that point it's too short time for them to develop it. So if there's a big injury on the face or injury on the neck, close to the brain where that virus is going to and causing the disease, it's a big wound, lots of blood, then they usually use hyperimmune serum, because that serum has the antibodies, it can kill the virus immediately, and they don't want to wait for the person to develop a vaccine response, because you don't know that incubation period. So, you need to basically stop this virus from getting to the brain.
Okay. I don't want to take over the question for the students, but you mentioned the severity of the wound. Are you saying that the severity of the wound will influence the likeliness of exposure to the virus?
Yeah. So deeper wounds that are neck, face, all of that is very close to the brain, very well perfused. So, but basically what the virus does, it travels up the nerve cells into the brain. And then it causes problems in the brain. It causes the changes of behavior. It causes the mood swings. It causes the aggression. In wildlife, they often become tame. So they come into houses like kudus that are tame and now standing into your yard. For me, that's an alarm bell. Then that you can't swallow. So they affect the swallowing muscles. So cows often present like choking. So they're choking cows, and when the farmer comes running over and he sees his favorite cow choking, what does he do? He puts his arm into the cow to rescue his favorite cow from choking, doesn't find anything, no potato lodged, no pieces of grain lodged, but now he's covered himself all with scratches and saliva, and now he's exposed himself to rabies.
Go for it, Marit.
So I live in Cape Town, and the seals in the area have been affected apparently by rabies as well. How do you suggest that they take that on? Because I mean, that's I don't know.
Do you want to know what I do or what the government is
What
doing?
would you, yes, what would you do?
No, I'm already part of the task team, so I'm just laughing.
Okay.
So there's already plans in place. So all these tame seals in Cape Town that sit on the platforms and so on, they are now vaccinating. So we know that the injectable vaccine works in dogs. We don't actually know if it works in seals, but we assume it does. So we're vaccinating all the ones that are easy to vaccinate or in person's view. And we're monitoring the ones obviously on the beaches. So that's the first plan in the moment. We're trying to figure out how effective that is. But there is at least 16 different cases. So it got into the seals a very long time ago and we didn't realize. Yeah. Because it wasn't a species. As you can saw from my thing, there was never a species that it was listed in. So obviously a jackal or a dog passed it on to a seal. And then because of the contact between the seals, they kiss each other, they cuddle together, they lie and sleep, they spread it easily. So that's a big problem now. So the government is doing a lot in allowing at least to vaccinate. Vaccinating with bait, they don't eat fish bait in little blocks. We've thought about this, but they will not eat. They will only eat live fish.
Okay.
So live fish, I can't vaccinate with rabies and hang out there. And then how do I make sure they ate the right mackerel when it swims by? So we haven't got an answer yet. There's a colleague of mine that works on poultry vaccines, and they actually spray them and they get into the oral mucosa, and that works. So maybe in 3 years' time, we can fly over the beach with a little crop duster and spray the vaccine and then actually hit the whole colony. So that's in the pipeline, but that's going to take some time and some planning and some trials and everything else. Yeah. In the moment, just vaccinate the ones that are close to people and that we can reach.
Fantastic. So we've got a couple questions from the students. Nomtandazo wants to know, how long does the rabies virus survive outside the host?
It doesn't. Great news. The virus really needs to be contact. Obviously, it's in the saliva, but it'll break down really quickly. So obviously, it depends a little bit on what tissue, but as our tissue decomposes, so will the virus. So it's obviously, if you come across a dead carcass in the field, it's got loads of saliva, it's got lots of virus. You want to handle it with gloves, you want to double bag it, you want to send it to the state vet, and you need to send it fresh because they want the brain fresh. But we can actually diagnose rabies really well, and that's how we actually found it in the seals from formalin samples. So even 5 years down the line, if we have a sliced brain, we can actually diagnose rabies.
Okay.
But normally we send whole brain in, and you can just send the head. Don't open the head up. You can just send the head in, and they can open it and they can test it. And I've even had ones that I collected in the field that was sort of 8 days dead, and the brain sort of we tipped it over and the brain ran out. So soupy consistency into the bowl, and even then we could still test it.
Okay.
So
but I think a rule of thumb for students: double bag gloves, and
do not take the risk. If you now bury the carcass, that rabies virus will die. It's not like it's going to stay in the environment for a very long time. So as the body decomposes and the pH changes, the rabies virus will be deactivated. So it's not something that's highly resistant, like anthrax, for example. It's not going to form spores and be found there 3 years later. That's a note. But a fresh carcass that still has bodily fluids still has virus.
Okay. Good to know. Good to know. Cello wants to know, well, thank you for the talk. Very informative. My question is, what symptoms should we look for in dogs that are infected, especially symptoms that are not noticeable to someone who is not a professional?
Okay, so it's always change of character. So the aggressive dog will become tame. The tame dog will become aggressive. So they always change their behavior. So that's why when a kudu that walks into your field is a problem. So what they normally do, so normally most of the domestic animals that are really friendly and nice become aggressive, while the wild animals that normally are really aggressive become docile. So it's a change in behavior. It's that's dripping saliva, that inability to swallow, often noticed. And then jackals in wildlife we often found around dams. So they often die right next to the dam, around the area where the water is, because I think they're really thirsty, but they can't drink. And then they're found around it and they die there. So around the dam, when you find a jackal around the dam dead, just lying there, it's always a bad sign.
Okay. And so in terms of that, I mean, a lot of people speak about hydrophobia. Is it more a case of that they can't swallow
people,
and that's why they can't?
Yeah, they can't. So people actually get afraid of water. So people people don't actually, they get afraid of water. And I think for the wildlife species, it's more that they can't swallow, they get really thirsty, but they don't want to come to the water, they don't want to drink. So they're there, they don't drink, and they're found next to it.
Okay. So the hydrophobia is more of a human thing than a wildlife
It's a human thing. I don't know. We can never ask the jackal or the dog. So it's not something, you know, if you put the bowl there, they just won't drink, but they're not going to run away from the bowl.
Yeah. Okay, got you. There's another question from Genesis. What about burning the affected host body instead of burying it to ensure that no species dig it out to feed on it?
It's fine. It's a complete option. It's not gonna, it's the same again. The fire will destroy it. It's not like it's gonna form spores and it goes in the environment like anthrax would. So again, it's a complete viable option. Yeah.
So I think for that, for the students to understand, there are some viruses and well, in fact, some diseases. We spoke about anthrax. We spoke about how long it lasts in the system. Rabies is not like that. So it's not going to exist and persist in the environment for a very long time. If it's a fresh carcass, yes, as Dr. Koeppel was mentioning, if the carcass is fresh, there's still a lot of virus left in the system, a lot of virus in the organs, in the bodily fluids, and that's when you need to be really cautious about it. But it's not going to sit in the environment like anthrax over years. Robin asks, I'd like to ask if you could tell us about your study journey of what you studied to research your current field of career, as it sounds very interesting.
Wow.
Good question, Robin.
Yeah, that's
Robin. I'm loving that challenge. So majority of my studies, because of where I am and what I do, I never planned. So I never, like the rabies and the seals we're looking at, I didn't plan that. I just got a phone call and said, hey, we've got funny rabies in a seal. Are you available for a meeting? The same was that. How Teng came to me is like, we've got an outbreak. It's in jackals. Do you have an idea how to fix it? And I went, what? I was like, well, have you got an idea how are we going to get this in control? Because you're the researcher. Come on, come up with a plan. So I usually sit together with the government, with the responsible people, and we chat over the room. And I was like, well, from a scientific point of view, I could suggest that. So let's do a study. Let's develop something. Let's see if this is optional. So think about a small pilot study. And my little pilot study was, I had 12 jackals, as you could see, that was in rehab. We got the bait blocks and we tried it. And they had antibodies. Okay, so figure one is done. We know that the vaccine works in the species, works really great in the species. So let's go to block 2. How do we get it to the species? How do we ensure the species eat it? So you take your journey into little blocks. And you see what you need to do in each block, and then you put the blocks together to get your pyramid.
So I don't
know, Robin, if that helps, but yeah. So a majority of my study, and that you will see if you look it up, and if you see my ORCID or Google Scholar or something, you'll see I'm all over the place. I like One Health. I do a lot of One Health work. I work a lot on the interface of human-wildlife conflict. So that's the diseases and the stuff I'm dealing with and everything in between. So yeah, most of my stuff, I really don't plan. I don't plan it. I didn't say, I want to make it. I'm not a lab person. So I usually have faced with a problem in the wild or an outbreak or a disease. And I'm standing there and saying, well, this is not good enough. We need to do the next step. What is the way forward? I can't just look at it and say, well, let's burn it and be end of it. But how do we prevent the next 10 carcasses? How do we prevent this? how do we go forward from here?
I think
And that's what I think as a scientist is important.
Yeah, I think a lot of students were asking about wildlife veterinary science in general, right? And how do you make that bridge from conservation to wildlife veterinary science? So I'm not too sure if you all knew this, but Dr. Koeppel is actually a phenomenal wildlife vet. That's what she does. And then she clearly didn't have enough things to do at the time, so she decided to do a PhD in research as well. There's all these types. As you go on in these fields, doors will open up, and it's up to you guys to kind of just grab onto the opportunities available that piques your interest, that you feel you can get involved with. I see Genesis is asking a question here. Has there ever been a species that could be a vector of rabies but yet was not affected, or a species in wildlife that was ever treated and cured, even if the species never functioned normally after, excluding the human who was mentioned earlier in the presentation?
So unfortunately, cure? No. We haven't cured anybody that we have treated. And because the disease is so zoonotic and so high risk, the state won't allow it. If you have a rabies positive case, they will highly suggest it will be euthanized. Because and you as a person have to take that chance. If you're not euthanizing, but somebody still has to work with that animal every single day, you're putting the person at risk. You're putting other animals. And because we can't cure it in the moment, if somebody is positive for rabies and not vaccinated, it's culled. If it's not human, if it's contact with rabies and not vaccinated, we cull because the risk is too high. That's the way that you're dealing with. But really interesting point, if you want to read about it, there's some hyenas, I think Kenya, Tanzania, that have rabies in their brain. They have rabies virus in their brain, and yet they don't die of it. So they have adapted to some extent to that particular, and we think it's a slightly milder form, but they live with it and they don't have a problem. But there's only one case report on this one out. But if you ever want to, there's something about hyenas and rabies virus, and they don't die of it. So it's possible. So some of the species can adapt with it. And if you think about the mongoose, so the mongoose have their rabies in their burrows. It's slightly different. And they also don't die of their virus as quickly as other species. So there is adaptation of the host to the virus.
That was a question I was going to ask you, Katja, is I saw on your slides, on your species list, I noticed there was nothing on hyenas or brown hyenas, especially in the cradle. Was that just never picked up in these hyenas?
No, we don't have a problem with hyenas in rabies in Southern Africa. There'll be the occasional one, but they're not the drivers. And if you're thinking about rabies, you want the really exciting thing? We don't have problem with rabies in the Kruger either. So
no, you say not a problem as it just we don't pick it up, or there hasn't been
one or two cases, it doesn't spread.
Wow.
So when there's a rabid jackal, the lions kill it quick. The apex predator actually takes it out, and then it doesn't tend to spread very far. So it depends about the dynamics. So that's what I said. You need a certain number of density of the species that's affected with the rabies to spread. Look, if we get it in wild dog in the Kruger, we lose the whole pack. And Madikwe lost their wild dogs twice with rabies. So, dangerous species, Ethiopian wolf, they wiped out 40% of the packs with rabies. So some of the really critical and dangerous species really highly affected by the virus and not adapted to it. They will just wipe out because haven't grown up with that disease. This is just the one hyenas that have it and don't actually show disease. They still die, but they live with it for like years before they die.
And this is the Lissa virus that you're speaking about that's in
it's
their
actually
brain.
a rabies virus. It's a rabies virus.
Okay.
They get, yeah. So like rabies Lissa virus. So you get the bat and you get the canine one. So they have the canine one.
Okay.
Okay, can I just come in with a question? Yeah, I don't know, maybe the students have already asked about this. Is there a rabies vaccine that maybe can be given through water, maybe on a well, rather than doing the fish thing? Because I
No,
thought maybe...
not yet. Not yet. We're working on it. Give us a bit of time.
Okay, because I was just thinking the fish thing would have been a job, because the water would be very easy, because when they go to drink and yeah.
No. So in the moment, no. But because it's a live virus, you know, the oral one has to be live. And we can't maintain that live virus in that water source in an adequate number to actually be effective.
Yeah, okay. Okay, thank you. I was just curious. And also...
Not yet, not yet.
Okay, Genesis, this one, she's very curious. I think he should ask it. He should come on video. We should see him. Is it a him or her? Genesis, can you please turn on your video and ask your question? We want to see you because you have asked several questions here.
Ma'am, I can't turn on my video.
Oh, yeah, at least we can hear your voice. Can you
Yes, ma'am.
now? Thank you so much for the questions.
Thank you, ma'am. It's a pleasure. When the species, like ma'am said, especially the hyena example that she gave, that they live with the virus in their minds. So when the species has adapted to the virus, are they still contagious to other species?
Yes. So even though the hyenas don't die of it, they still can spread it to other species if it's in their saliva. So you have to remember that the virus is not always in the saliva. So we've had that 8 months in the human. In dogs, it's been reported as well that it takes up to 6 months to show clinical signs. It's only just before the clinical signs that come on that the virus is actually in the brain and actually spreading into the saliva. So the hyena would only become infectious if it shows clinical signs or just before it shows clinical signs.
Okay, ma'am.
So while the virus is just dormant, it can't be spread by that animal.
Yes, ma'am.
Does that
And that's
answer?
why it makes it so difficult to diagnose something with rabies, because I can't test if that dog's been bitten if it has rabies. I can't test for it. The only way I would know it has rabies if I slice open its brain and look for Negri bodies, which is the accumulation of the virus in the brain, or do a histochem. So that's pretty much dead when I do that. So there is no diagnosis currently that can diagnose the exposure to the rabies virus, that the rabies virus is now in the brain. We can't pick it up in the blood. We can't pick it up anywhere else. So that's why that incubation period is such a disaster, because we can't pick it up. Once there's clinical signs, we can pick the virus back up in the saliva or in the excretions and so on. But till then, it hides in the body and we can't pick it up. We only pick it up if we go into the brain and look for it. And that usually it's effective with death.
So does that mean the rabies cases are usually discovered at like a later stage after many other species have been affected?
Yes, correct. So we had the one that was positive for rabies and we were screened it for something else. What happened is they were sending it over to a research project in the States for demonic acid, which is the algae bloom, because it was a funny behaving seizuring seal. So they sent it for that and it came back negative. And then they started looking at the brain and realized, but hang on, it's got rabies. And then they went starting looking for it. And then they screened all the seals that have gone up for postmortem to our laboratory in the past few years and seen where it came from. And then they realized that rabies actually has been in the seals for a period of time and nobody picked it up.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Genesis, are you good? Are you happy?
I'm shocked and happy. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I can see our own Maret. My colleague Maret has her hand up. Maret, can you go for it?
Yes, thank you. So I want to ask, and I'm sorry if this is a stupid question, but how do they know the hyenas have rabies and are living with it?
They basically did some antibody testing, so they have their rabies antibodies, and then they screened some. It was a retrospect study, so where they looked at all the carcasses and screened it all and so on. So it was a long-term study. If you're really interested in, I can find out that particular study. But yeah, it's the only one it's reported where they lived for up to 120 days with the virus without actually showing clinical signs.
Oh wow. Yeah, because you would think, because they are like scavengers, so they eat carcasses of many.
Yeah, but it's only that
animals.
one study that has it. Nobody else has shown it. So it must have been that virus in that particular population that's been there for a while. So they somehow adapted to it.
Interesting. Thank you.
That was very interesting. It seems all is clear. Maybe you should ask them questions.
I did during the presentation. I just gave him enough time to think about it.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, thank you so much, Professor, for your time and for everything. This was very interesting. We have learned a lot. And yeah, thank you so much to the students. They have been good audience. Special thanks to Genesis.
Yes, thank you for participating and all the interesting questions.
Yeah. And Karen, thank you so much for coming in, you know, the internet things and everything. Thank you so much. And yeah, reaching this time, I think we have come to an end of our talk. Yeah, I'm wishing a good night to all of you guys. And it was nice interacting with you all.